She was holding his hand when the paramedics arrived. She was already crying before anyone told her he was dead. It was 6:43 in the morning on March 9th, 2019, when the 911 call came through to the Boulder County Emergency Dispatch Center in Colorado. A woman's voice, trembling and fractured, reported that her husband was unresponsive. She said she had woken up and found him like that. Cold to the touch, barely breathing, his lips already edging toward blue. The dispatcher urged her to begin CPR. She said she didn't know how. She said she was panicking. She said she loved him. By the time first responders reached the upscale home at 4417 Ridgecrest Drive, Ryan Cooper, 38, was beyond saving. He was pronounced dead at the scene. His wife, Melissa Cooper, 35, stood in the front doorway wrapped in a silk robe, tears tracking silently down her face as paramedics worked with the grim mechanical certainty of people who already know the outcome. On the surface, this looked like a tragedy. A young man, seemingly healthy, dead in the night. A grieving widow. A quiet neighborhood still dark with early morning. But one of the responding paramedics, a 12-year veteran named Daniel Ortiz, would later tell investigators something that lodged itself like a splinter in the mind of the detective who heard it. Melissa Cooper had been kneeling beside her husband's body when they arrived. She was holding his hand, and her hands were warm. Not the hands of a woman who had just discovered her husband and called 911 in a panic. The hands of a woman who had been there for a while. The question no one asked in that first hour would become the question that defined the entire investigation. How long had she really known he was dying? Asterisk. Ryan Cooper was, by all accounts, a man whose life had been built piece by piece into something enviable. A software architect who had co-founded a tech consulting firm in Denver, he had accumulated considerable wealth by his mid-30s. He drove a black Tesla Model S. He coached youth soccer on weekends. His LinkedIn profile described him as passionate, driven, and community-minded. His Instagram, mostly maintained by Melissa, showed hiking trips to Telluride, anniversary dinners at Boulder's finest restaurants, and a golden retriever named Captain. Melissa Cooper, born Melissa Hargrove, had met Ryan at a charity gala in 2013. She had been working then as a pharmaceutical sales representative, a job she quit 2 years into the marriage to, as she told friends, focus on building their life together. Those who knew her described her as magnetic, confident, occasionally intense. Her college roommate, when interviewed by detectives, used a different word: calculating. The marriage from the outside looked successful. But those who peered even slightly beneath the surface saw something else. Ryan's business partner, Greg Haynes, told investigators that Ryan had seemed distracted and withdrawn in the months before his death. He had mentioned, casually at first, and then with greater urgency, that things at home weren't right. He hadn't elaborated much. But Haynes remembered one specific moment in late January 2019, 6 weeks before Ryan's death, when Ryan had said, "I think she wants out, Greg. I just don't know what that means for me." At the time, Haynes had assumed it was the language of a man bracing for a painful divorce. In hindsight, standing in a detective's office 8 months later, he believed it may have been something darker. A man afraid of what his wife might do. Or a man who simply didn't know yet what she had already decided. The Boulder County medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Shen, conducted the autopsy on Ryan Cooper on March 11, 2019. The initial examination was inconclusive for any obvious cause of death. No trauma to the body, no signs of struggle. His heart, lungs, and liver appeared structurally normal for a man of his age and fitness level. The preliminary report listed the cause of death as undetermined pending toxicological analysis. Toxicology, in most natural death investigations, is a formality. In the Cooper case, it became everything. 6 weeks after Ryan Cooper's death, the tox screen results returned from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Laboratory. The findings stopped Dr. Shen mid-sentence when she read them. Present in Ryan Cooper's bloodstream was a significant concentration of colchicine, a medication used to treat gout and certain inflammatory conditions, but one that, in elevated doses, is acutely lethal. Colchicine poisoning mimics the symptoms of many natural causes of death, including cardiac arrest and multi-organ failure. It is frequently missed in standard toxicology panels because it requires specific testing to detect. It had been detected here only because a second-tier expanded panel had been ordered as a precaution given Ryan Cooper's young age. Colchicine has no antidote. Once absorbed in sufficient quantity, it shuts down cell division throughout the body, destroying tissue systematically and lethally. Death typically occurs between 1 and 3 days after ingestion at toxic doses. Medical examiners and forensic toxicologists recognize it as one of the most difficult poisons to detect post-mortem if investigators are not specifically looking for it. Someone had given Ryan Cooper a drug designed to kill him slowly, and they had almost gotten away with it. Dr. Shen amended the cause of death to acute colchicine toxicity. Homicide. The case was immediately transferred to the Boulder County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit. Detective Sandra Marlowe, a 17-year veteran with a specialty in domestic homicide, was assigned as lead investigator. Sandra Marlowe was not the kind of detective who announced herself loudly. Colleagues described her as methodical to the point of obsession, someone who read case files the way other people read novels. Slowly, cover to cover, circling back to reread passages that felt wrong. When she received the Cooper file, she spent 3 full days reviewing it before conducting a single interview. What she noticed first was what wasn't in the file. There were no medical records for Ryan Cooper indicating gout or any inflammatory condition that would have required a colchicine prescription. There was no prescription for colchicine in his name or in Melissa Cooper's name in the state pharmacy database. There were no bottles of the drug found in the Cooper home during the initial walkthrough. A walkthrough, Marlowe noted with quiet frustration, that had been conducted by patrol officers with no expectation of foul play. The source of the colchicine was the first question. The second question was timing. Based on Ryan Cooper's toxicology results and the concentration of the drug in his system, Dr. Shen estimated that the fatal dose had been administered somewhere between 36 and 60 hours before death. That placed the window of poisoning between the evening of March 7th and the morning of March 8th, 2019. Marlowe pulled surveillance footage from the neighborhood security cameras around Ridgecrest Drive. She reviewed cell phone records for both Ryan and Melissa Cooper. She obtained credit card and bank records. She built a timeline, hour by hour, of the 72 hours preceding Ryan Cooper's death. Then she went to speak with Melissa Cooper for the first time. Grieving widows lie. Guilty widows lie more carefully. Marlowe knew the difference. The first interview with Melissa Cooper took place on May 2, 2019, in the conference room of the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. Melissa arrived with an attorney, a detail that Marlowe noted without visible reaction. She was composed, dressed simply in dark clothing, her grief performing itself at a measured and appropriate frequency. She answered questions calmly. She said she had no idea how Ryan could have been poisoned. She said their marriage, while having some stresses, had been fundamentally loving and committed. She said she missed him every moment of every day. But Marlowe had come prepared. She asked Melissa about the evening of March 7th, what they had eaten, who had prepared dinner, whether they had guests, whether anything unusual had happened. Melissa said she had cooked dinner at home. Pasta, she said, a simple meal. Ryan had seemed tired, maybe slightly unwell, but nothing alarming. She had assumed he was coming down with something. They had gone to bed around 10. Marlowe then asked a question that seemed incidental but wasn't. Did Melissa have any familiarity with colchicine? Had she ever handled it, researched it, or known anyone who used it? Melissa paused. The pause lasted approximately 4 seconds, long enough for Marlowe to note it precisely in her interview log. Then Melissa said no. She had no idea what that was before hearing it in the context of Ryan's case. The next morning, Marlowe obtained Melissa Cooper's search history from her personal laptop and personal phone, subpoenaed through a warrant granted on the basis of the homicide ruling. What she found did not surprise her so much as confirm what she had already begun to suspect. On February 22, 2019, 15 days before Ryan Cooper died, Someone using Melissa's home laptop had searched, colchicine lethal dose human. On February 24th, a second search, colchicine detection toxicology. On February 27th, symptoms of colchicine overdose timeline. The searches had been conducted using a private browser window. But private browsing, investigators are well aware, does not erase forensic artifacts from the device's cache and registry files. She had researched how to poison him. She had researched how hard it would be to detect. And then she had told the detective she didn't know what colchicine was. The question of how Melissa Cooper obtained colchicine became a significant thread in the investigation. The drug, while prescription only in standard doses, exists in a gray market of online pharmaceutical vendors, particularly those operating outside strict U.S. regulatory oversight. Marlowe's team, working with the DEA's Denver field office, began tracing purchases of colchicine through online pharmacies in the weeks preceding Ryan's death. The breakthrough came not through online records but through a cash transaction. A pharmacist at a small independent pharmacy in Longmont, Colorado, 20 miles from Boulder, came forward after seeing news reports about the case. He told investigators that a woman matching Melissa Cooper's description had visited his pharmacy in early February 2019, inquiring about colchicine. He recalled the visit because the woman had been unusually specific in her questions about dosage thresholds, asking what quantity would be considered dangerous for someone without an underlying condition. He had been uncomfortable enough to remember her. He had not been uncomfortable enough at the time to report it. He couldn't make a positive identification. Melissa's attorney was quick to exploit this. But the pharmacist's testimony established a behavioral pattern that supported what the digital evidence was already suggesting. Someone had been researching colchicine's lethal parameters systematically in the weeks before Ryan Cooper died. Investigators also examined Melissa's financial records with particular attention to cash withdrawals and purchases that couldn't be traced to identifiable retailers. In the 6 weeks before Ryan's death, Melissa had made 4 cash withdrawals totaling $2,400, an unusual pattern for a woman who otherwise conducted nearly all of her transactions digitally. She could not account satisfactorily for the cash when asked. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Coopers' marriage deepened. Marlowe's team obtained records from a family law attorney in Denver named Christopher Vall. According to those records, Melissa Cooper had made a confidential consultation appointment with Volley on January 14, 2019, 2 months before Ryan's death, to discuss the financial implications of divorce. She had brought documentation, including records of Ryan's business valuation and their joint asset portfolio. Volley's notes, produced under subpoena, indicated that Melissa had asked specifically about the difference in financial outcome between divorce and being widowed. She had sat across from a divorce attorney and asked what she would get if Ryan died instead. The attorney had answered the question. She had not filed for divorce. 3 years before his death, Ryan Cooper had taken out a $2.8 million term life insurance policy. The beneficiary was Melissa Cooper. There was a standard 2-year contestability clause, meaning that if death occurred within 2 years of the policy's issuance under suspicious circumstances, the insurer could contest the payout. That 2-year window had expired 14 months before Ryan died. The timing was not lost on Marlowe. Ryan Cooper had died at a moment when the life insurance policy was fully in force, uncontestable, and payable without delay. Had he died 13 months earlier, the payout would have been in legal jeopardy. Had he filed for divorce instead, Melissa's financial settlement, while substantial given the couple's assets, would have been significantly less than $2.8 million, particularly given the prenuptial agreement they had signed, which protected a significant portion of Ryan's business equity. Investigators also discovered that Melissa Cooper had made a phone call to the life insurance company on February 16, 2019, 3 weeks before Ryan's death, to confirm the policy status, beneficiary designation, and payout procedures in the event of her husband's death. The insurance company representative who took the call flagged it in their internal system as unusual. It had not been shared with law enforcement at the time because no investigation was yet underway. The call lasted 11 minutes. Marlowe presented this information to the Boulder County District Attorney's Office on July 8, 2019. She laid out the case as she had constructed it. The colchicine in Ryan Cooper's system, the lethal concentration consistent with deliberate administration over a meal, the digital search history showing premeditated research into the drug's lethality and detectability, the consultation with a divorce attorney, and the specific question about widowhood versus divorce. The insurance inquiry 3 weeks before death, the cash withdrawals, and the pharmacist's account of a woman asking precisely the questions a poisoner would need answered. The district attorney, James Harker, reviewed the case file over a weekend. On Monday, July 10, 2019, he authorized the arrest of Melissa Cooper on 1 count of first-degree murder. Melissa Cooper was arrested at 8:15 in the morning on July 11, 2019, at the home she had shared with Ryan on Ridgecrest Drive. Detective Marlowe led the arrest team personally. By all accounts, Melissa opened the front door already dressed, as though she had been expecting them or had simply not slept. She said nothing as the handcuffs were applied. Her attorney was called before the patrol car had left the driveway. The arrest was front-page news in Boulder within hours and had spread nationally by afternoon. But beneath the surface-level drama, investigators were still working. The arrest was not the end of the case building. It was, in many ways, the beginning of its most technically demanding phase. Prosecutors needed to prove not merely that colchicine had killed Ryan Cooper, but that Melissa Cooper had administered it. There was no direct witness. There was no confession. There was no video of a poison being added to food. What they had was a constellation of circumstantial evidence, powerful, interlocking, and deeply suggestive, but not a single piece that alone constituted proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In murder trials, circumstantial evidence convicts more often than direct evidence, but only if the jury understands how the pieces fit together. That was the prosecution's job now. In the months between the arrest and trial, the prosecution worked closely with forensic toxicologist Dr. Howard Marsh of the University of Colorado School of Medicine to build an airtight scientific framework for the jury. Dr. Marsh's analysis of Ryan Cooper's toxicology results was central to this effort. Marsh calculated that the concentration of colchicine in Ryan's bloodstream at the time of his death was consistent with ingestion of approximately 3 to 5 milligrams, a quantity far above the therapeutic range of 0.6 to 1.8 milligrams used in legitimate medical treatment, and well within the documented lethal range for a person of Ryan's body weight. The drug had been absorbed over a period consistent with oral ingestion, likely in food or drink, and had caused progressive multisystem failure over approximately 48 hours. The timeline Dr. Marsh constructed supported the prosecution's theory precisely. Ryan had shown the first subtle signs of illness, fatigue, mild nausea, on the evening of March 7th, the night Melissa acknowledged cooking dinner for them at home. His condition had worsened through March 8th, a day Melissa later acknowledged he had spent largely in bed, which she attributed to what she believed was a stomach bug. By the morning of March 9th, he was in the final stages of colchicine-induced multi-organ failure. Marsh testified at a pretrial hearing that the pattern of symptoms described by Melissa in her original 911 call and in subsequent interviews was entirely consistent with colchicine poisoning and inconsistent with any natural cause of death he could identify. He also testified that colchicine, when dissolved in liquid or incorporated into certain foods, is tasteless and odorless. A person consuming it would have no awareness of having done so. The defense retained their own toxicologist, Dr. Sandra Bell of Northwestern University, who disputed some of Marsh's timeline calculations and argued that the concentration levels, while high, fell within a theoretical range that could result from an accidental exposure scenario. The prosecution's rebuttal was direct. There was no identified source of accidental exposure, no colchicine in the home, and no legitimate medical reason for Ryan Cooper to have the drug in his system at any concentration. The digital forensics component of the prosecution's case was presented to the jury through FBI-certified digital forensics examiner, Agent Katrina Dominguez, who had been brought in to assist the Boulder County investigation given the complexity of the evidence extraction. Dominguez walked the jury methodically through the process by which Melissa Cooper's search history had been recovered. She explained that private browsing mode does not prevent the creation of forensic artifacts on the device itself, that DNS cache records, Windows registry entries, and browser database fragments retain recoverable evidence of browsing sessions even when the user believes they have erased their tracks. She had recovered 12 distinct searches on Melissa Cooper's laptop between February 18th and March 1st, 2019, all related to colchicine pharmacology, lethal dosing, and detection windows in post-mortem examination. The defense challenged Dominguez's methodology, suggesting the possibility of malware or remote access that could have generated the searches without Melissa's knowledge. Dominguez dismantled this theory with characteristic precision. The searches had been made during a time period when the laptop's location data placed it at the Cooper residence. The typing patterns and search refinements showed an iterative human intelligence at work rather than automated behavior, and there was no evidence of any malware or unauthorized access on the device. Beyond the search history, the prosecution presented evidence recovered from Melissa's phone, a text message exchange, recovered in fragments from deleted data, between Melissa and an unidentified number in late February 2019. The content was partial but significant. In one fragment, Melissa had written, "How long before they stop looking?" In another, recovered 3 days later, "He'll never know." The recipient's number traced to a prepaid burner phone purchased with cash, never recovered. She had been communicating with someone. Who? About what? The ghost on the other end of those messages was never conclusively identified, but the words themselves spoke clearly enough. The trial of Melissa Cooper, State of Colorado versus Melissa Ann Cooper, began on February 3, 2020, in the Boulder County District Court before the Honorable Judge Robert Alcott. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Claire Ngayan, widely regarded as one of the most technically skilled prosecutors in the state. The defense was led by Thomas Elridge, a high-profile criminal defense attorney from Denver known for his work in complex circumstantial cases. The prosecution's opening statement was measured and methodical. Nguyen told the jury that they would not be presented with a confession or a video or a single smoking gun. What they would be presented with was something more powerful. A pattern. A pattern of research, preparation, acquisition, administration, and deception that pointed unmistakably and exclusively to one person. She told the jury that by the time testimony concluded, they would understand not just that Ryan Cooper had been poisoned, but how and why and by whom. Elridge's opening was more aggressive. He told the jury that the prosecution's case was a tapestry of coincidence dressed up as conspiracy, that the digital evidence had been misinterpreted and was inconclusive, that the pharmacist's identification was inadmissibly vague, and that the insurance consultation had been standard financial planning that the prosecution had deliberately framed to seem sinister. He told them his client was an innocent woman who had lost her husband and was now losing her freedom to a theory. Testimony ran for 19 days. The prosecution called 23 witnesses. Key among them were Dr. Shen, the medical examiner, Dr. Marsh, the forensic toxicologist, Agent Dominguez, the digital forensics examiner, Greg Haynes, Ryan's business partner, and Christopher Volley, the divorce attorney whose notes had been subpoenaed. Volley's testimony was among the most damaging. When he read his own notes from the stand, specifically the note recording Melissa's question about the financial difference between divorce and widowhood, an audible reaction moved through the courtroom. Elridge's cross-examination was fierce but could not dislodge the note itself. It existed. Volley had written it contemporaneously. The question had been asked. The defense's most effective moments came during their cross-examination of the toxicology experts, when they succeeded in planting modest doubt about the precision of the poisoning timeline, and during their questioning of the pharmacist, whose failure to positively identify Melissa was underscored repeatedly for the jury. They also hammered on the unidentified burner phone, arguing that its existence suggested the involvement of an unknown third party who had never been adequately investigated by law enforcement. Melissa Cooper did not testify in her own defense. Elridge made this decision explicitly and explained it to the court. The prosecution had constructed a portrait of a calculating woman and placing her on the stand would only give them an opportunity to reinforce it. The jury would have to convict on evidence alone, not on demeanor. The courtroom was silent on the final day of testimony. Everyone had heard the case. Now came the only part that mattered. Claire Nguyen's closing argument lasted 4 hours. She began with Ryan Cooper, not with evidence, not with timelines, but with the man himself. She described him as someone who had believed his home was safe, who had sat down to a meal prepared by his wife without suspicion, without fear, without any awareness that he had approximately 48 hours left to live. She let that image settle in the jury's minds before she began the methodical, piece-by-piece reconstruction of the evidence. She walked the jury through the search history as though reading from a diary of premeditation. She showed them the divorce attorney's notes and the insurance inquiry, placed side by side in timeline form, and asked them to consider what those two data points meant in conjunction. She quoted Melissa's statement to detectives that she had no knowledge of colchicine, then projected the search history on the courtroom screen behind her and said nothing for a long moment. She didn't need to. The 12 searches, dated and time-stamped, did the work themselves. Nguyen walked the jury through Dr. Marsh's timeline with the methodical patience of a professor and the quiet urgency of a prosecutor who understood what was at stake. She reminded them of Daniel Ortiz, the paramedic. 12 years of experience, 2,000 calls. A man who knew what warm hands meant when the husband was already cold. She reminded them of the $2.8 million insurance policy waiting to pay out. She reminded them that Melissa Cooper had called the insurance company 11 days before she cooked Ryan dinner for the last time. She concluded with the medical examiner's finding. Ryan Cooper had not died. He had been killed. The law recognized the difference, and so did every person in that room. The jury of 7 women and 5 men began deliberations on March 2, 2020. They deliberated for 3 full days. They requested readbacks of Dr. Marsh's testimony, the digital forensics report, and the divorce attorney's notes. Investigators and court staff read these requests as signals of rigor, a jury taking seriously its responsibility, testing every piece of evidence against the weight of reasonable doubt. On the morning of March 5, 2020, they sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled with a specific kind of silence that only exists in that moment. After the case, before the outcome. Melissa Cooper sat at the defense table, her hands folded. Detective Marlowe sat in the gallery's front row, as she had every day of the trial. Dr. Shen was present. Greg Haynes was present. Ryan Cooper's parents, who had attended every single session, sat together and held each other's hands. The jury filed in. The foreperson, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Adler, held the verdict form without visible emotion. Judge Alcott asked the question the law required him to ask. The foreperson rose. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Ryan Allen Cooper, the jury found Melissa Ann Cooper guilty. The sound in the courtroom was not dramatic. It was the particular quiet of a verdict absorbed. The exhale of a room that had been holding its breath for 14 months. Ryan Cooper's mother pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. Greg Haynes stared at the floor. Detective Marlowe, who had once been described by a colleague as the last person who would ever cry in public, looked at nothing in particular for a long moment and blinked twice. Melissa Cooper showed nothing. She sat with the same composure she had carried into every hearing, every interview, every photograph taken in the 14 months between her husband's death and this moment. She turned once to look at Elridge, who placed a hand briefly on her forearm. Then she looked forward again. The bailiff moved toward her. The handcuffs came out. And the case of Ryan Cooper, the man who had gone to sleep in his own home, in his own bed, beside the woman he had married, reached the end of its long, painstaking journey toward the only resolution that remained possible. The truth, confirmed, ratified, and recorded by 12 people who had listened to everything and believed what the evidence told them. Ryan Cooper was 38 years old. He had coached soccer on weekends. He had a golden retriever named Captain. He had trusted the wrong person with his life. And now, inside a courtroom in Boulder, Colorado, on a cold March morning, the law had finished saying his name.